Hi there. I know you may be thinking, what is behaviorism? Let me make it simpler for you. Behaviorism is a type of psychology and the theory of learning. Everything we know about behaviorism is through observation and experimentation. It is not concerned with internal thoughts like thinking or emotions. In summary, the behaviorism is based on the stimulus response. After defining the term of behaviorism, let's take a look to the founders and proponents. Ivan Pavlov. He did the experiment with dogs. He came up with the theory of the classical conditioning. John Watson. He did the experiment called Little Albert that presents an example of how classical conditioning can be used to condition an emotional response. Moreover, Watson gets credit for establishing the psychological school of behaviorism. Skinner is responsible for the term operant conditioning. Skinner heavily emphasizes that positive reinforcement is the most effective way to encourage a desirable behavior. On the other hand, negative reinforcement will extinguish a behavior.
What is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is a kind of learning that occurs when a conditional stimulus is paired with an unconditional stimulus. After pairing is repeated, the organism exhibits a conditioned response to the conditional stimulus when the conditional stimulus is presented alone. Ivan Pavlov provided the most famous example of classical conditioning. Pavlov developed a procedure that enabled him to study the digestive processes of animals over long periods of time. Let me show you an example. Well, we're presenting Robert with a stimulus here, a bell. When we ring the bell, there's no response in Robert. That's because dogs, just like human beings, are not naturally wired to have a response to a bell. Without conditioning, there is no response. Therefore, we call the bell a neutral stimulus. I can ring the bell repeatedly with no response from Robert. Next, we'll introduce Robert to a new stimulus, the sight of food and water. Robert's natural response to the sight of food and water is to salivate. He wasn't conditioned to have this reaction. It's naturally innate or inborn, no automatic, no thought, no condition. So this stimulus is called an unconditioned stimulus, and Robert's response is called an unconditioned response. Next, simulate Pavlov's experiment. Ring the bell and then present Robert with food and water. Robert salivates, not because of the bell, which is a neutral stimulus, but because of the food, the unconditioned stimulus. Now we are going to repeat this process. If we repeatedly ring the bell before presenting Robert with food, he will be conditioned to respond to the bell. Now, Robert will salivate upon hitting the bell, even in the absence of food. The response has been conditioned. It's now a conditioned response, and the bell has become a conditioned stimulus.
Stimulus substitution theory by Pavlov. Pavlov suggested that as a result of conditioning, the conditioned stimulus become able to elicit the same response as the unconditioned stimulus. Why would Pavlov assume that the conditioned response and unconditioned response were the same response? Pavlov was observing the same digestive response, for example, saliva and gaseous juice, as both the conditional response and unconditional response. The fact that both the conditional stimulus and unconditional stimulus elicit similar responses logically leads to the conclusion that the conditional response and unconditional response are the same. How does the conditional stimulus become able to elicit the same response as the unconditional stimulus? According to Pavlov, the presentation of the unconditional stimulus activates one area of the brain a stimulation of the neural area responsible for the processing the unconditional stimulus. This is the activation of a brain center responsible for generating the unconditional response. In Pablo's view, an inactive, directed connection exists between the unconditional stimulus brain center and the brain center controlling the unconditional response. This neural connection allows the unconditional stimulus to elicit the unconditional response. How might the connection between the conditional stimulus and conditional response develop? When the conditional stimulus is presented, it is excited at distinct brain area. When the unconditional stimulus follows the conditional stimulus, the brain centers responsible for processing the conditional stimulus and unconditional stimulus are activated at the same time. According to Pavlov, the simultaneous activity on two neural centers leads to a new functional neural pathway between the active centers. The establishment of this neural connection causes the conditional stimulus to activate the neural center processing the conditional stimulus, which then arouses the unconditional stimulus neural center. Activity in the unconditional stimulus center leads to activation in the response center from the unconditional response, which then allows the unconditional stimulus to elicit the conditional response. Pavlov's stimulus substitution theory of classical conditioning. A. The unconditional stimulus activates the unconditional stimulus brain center, which elicits the unconditional response. Letter B. The conditional stimulus arouses the area of the brain responsible for processing it. Letter C. A connection develops between the conditional stimulus and unconditional stimulus brain centers with the continuous presentation of conditional stimulus and unconditional stimulus. And D. The conditional stimulus elicits the conditional response as a result of this ability to activate the unconditional stimulus brain center.
Classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Let's talk about classical conditioning first. As my classmate has already explained, Ivan Pavlov did some really famous experiments on dogs. He showed dogs some food and rang a bell at the same time. After a while, the dog will associate the bell with the food. They will learn that when they heard the bell, they will get fed. So, we call the food an unconditional stimulus, and we call salivation the unconditional response. However, when we pair an unconditional stimulus, like food, with something was previously neutral, like the sound of a bell, that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. And so, classical conditioning was discovered. We see how this works with animals. But how does it work with humans? In exactly the same way. For example, let's say that one day you go to the doctor to get a shot. She says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit," and then gives you the most painful shot you ever had. A few weeks later, you go to the dentist for a checkup. He starts to put a mirror in your mouth to examine your tooth and says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit." Even though you know the mirror won't hurt you, you jump out of the chair and run screaming from the room. When you went to get a shot, the words, "This won't hurt a bit," became a conditioned stimulus. When they were paired with pain of the shot, the unconditional stimulus, which was followed by your conditional response of getting out of there. And that's classical conditioning. On the other hand, operant conditioning explains how consequences lead to change in voluntary behavior. But how does operant conditioning work? There are two main components in operant conditioning: reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement make it more likely that you will do something again, while punishers make it less likely. Reinforcement and punishment can be positive or negative, but this doesn't mean good and bad. Positive means the addition of a stimulus, like getting a dessert after you finish your veggies. And negative means the removal of a stimulus, like getting an eye of no homework because you did well on an exam. Woohoo!
Advantage or disadvantage of behaviorism. Advantage. Number 1. Shapes behavior quickly. For example, every time a student will arrive to classroom, time the teacher could give the students on time times. This point could be used to purchase a watch from the scout store. It's like a gift for the students. Number 2. The learning adapts to the environment. For example, the class has been trained to write a half page every day. They are reinforced with a small sticker. As you can see, the students who are studying kindergarten, when they are finished their homework assignment, the teacher always gives a small sticker as a gift or as a want. Number 3. Behavior can be measured. As an example, a student can take tests to measure whether they can answer the question correctly. Disadvantage. Internalized reasoning may not be an outcome. As an example, a student may act respectful but not feel respect towards the teacher. It means it's when the teacher is teaching that the students may act respectful but not feel respect toward the teacher. Number 2. The learners adapt to a poor environment. For example, a student adapts to a classroom where the other students' behaviors are negative and destructive, and maybe they don't pay attention. So this affects the learning environment. Number 3. Behavior measure may not be a true picture of understanding. For example, taking a true or false test with the assurance or retaking it until the student gets it right can lead to guessing for the correct answer. As the teacher presents like an exam, like a test, or maybe like a simple exercise.